The Magicka Templar is undoubtedly one of the most spectacular and powerful classes in ESO. Unlocking its full potential though in a game this complex and intricate can feel super overwhelming. This beginner guide is going to give you a solid foundation for the class, offer a basic insight into the intricacies of building the Templar, as well as solid 1-bar and 2-bar builds to get you started. As a quick note, if you're looking for my detailed master guide for the Magicka Templar, it is on the way. It's in the hands of the best editor on YouTube as we speak. So make sure that you join the Discord to get pinged as soon as it goes live, as well as to access my written guides for these build videos. Before we even touch anything related to our 1 and 2-bar builds though, let's start by discussing the fundamentals of the Magicka Templar. The cornerstone of our rotations center around the skill Power of the Light. This ability in terms of raw damage output is one of the strongest on our bar, dealing a small amount of damage on application and a massive tick of damage on its explosion. When maintained properly, the skill will be worth about 10% of our DPS output. However, you don't get its insane massive tick of damage unless you let the ability fully expire. So the rotation minigame on the Templar requires Power of the Light to be reapplied as close to the second that it explodes as possible to maximize damage. In addition to this, Power of the Light applies the Sundered status effect, which does a small amount of damage and increases our weapon and spell damage, and Power of the Light will act as the primary catalyst to our Illuminate and Prism passives. The Illuminate passive is the Templar's quote-unquote unique buff. It offers the only source of minor sorcery in the game for 20 seconds whenever you activate a Dawn's Wrath ability, i.e. Power of the Light, increasing your group's weapon and spell damage by a whopping 10%. The major minor buff system is a key pillar in an ESO raid composition. All the buffs and debuffs in the game have a major and minor iteration, with the majors providing more of a given buffer debuff than the minors. You can stack these varying levels of buffs and debuffs, just not the same ones, so you can have major and minor sorcery, but running 2 sources of major sorcery will not stack, for example. That said though, stats in ESO scale off your highest offensive stats, so if your spell damage is higher than your weapon damage, all of your DPS will use spell damage as your modifier. So even though the Templar is the only source in the game of the minor spell damage buff, the DK does offer the minor weapon damage buff. So while I wish that I could tell you that every group should include a Templar for its unique buff, the truth is that the job can get done with either a Templar or a DK. Finally, Power of the Light will also proc our Prism passive consistently, which generates 3 ultimate whenever we cast a Dawn's Wrath ability with a 6-second cooldown. Coincidentally, Power of the Light should be cast exactly once every 6 seconds, so we'll constantly be benefiting from this passive with a solid rotation. The other pillar to the Templar rotation is centered around our unique execute ability, Radiant Oppression. The skill ramps up in damage based on the amount of health a target has, starting at 50% of an enemy's HP. At about 42%, Radiant Oppression will be stronger than our primary spammable jabs, and eventually it will do so much damage that it won't be worth casting anything else, dealing up to 250k damage per second at a max tick of 155k. That is insane damage. Because this skill is so strong, maximizing damage with the Templar involves knowing when to stop using certain abilities in favor of simply using Radiant Oppression instead. How do we know when this is worthwhile though? The simplest explanation that I can offer is through a comparison. Let's look at a commonly used dot like Degeneration compared to Radiant Oppression. Degen will tick at up to 9.7k once every 2 seconds. The skill lasts 22 seconds, which means that it will tick 11 times. 9.7 times 11 means that Degen can do up to 106k total damage, assuming that we let the dot get its full duration. So one cast of Degen is worth 106k damage, we just have to wait 22 seconds. Abilities can be cast up to once every second if your weaving is perfect, so when measuring whether a dot is or isn't worth running in general, we will want the dot to get more total damage done from one cast over its entire duration compared to one cast of our spammable. Radiant Oppression will do about 120k damage over 2 seconds, so if we divide that by 2, that equates to about 60k per second for that cast that we discussed, which is less than what one cast of Degen is worth. However, at some point that value is amplified to 250k, which means that there is a percentage threshold where Degen is no longer worth casting. The execute rotation and priorities have figured this out for you. That is, at exactly what percentage threshold a cast of Radiant Oppression becomes more worth a cast of Degeneration. We will explore this topic in the rotation section of the video thoroughly. Outside of these 2 key rotational aspects of the Templar, there are a few more class passives to discuss that contribute to the unique playstyle of the class. Most of our passives are pretty self-explanatory. Balanced Warrior offers a straight 6% weapon weapon and spell damage increase. Enduring Raise adds duration to a couple of our abilities, and Restoring Spirit reduces the cost of all of our abilities, including our ultimate. The last major passive worth discussing a bit though is Burning Light. Whenever we deal damage, we are granted a stack of Burning Light up to once every half second. Once we reach 4 stacks, Burning Light will explode and do a ton of damage, resulting in about 7 to 8k DPS. For context, some of the strongest 5-piece sets in the game are only worth 8 to 10k DPS. This is literally free damage. Running abilities that tick multiple times per second, like jabs or Radiant Oppression, helps proc Burning Light a bit more often. But in general, if we are maintaining good time on target and following our ABCs, always be casting, then we will min-max damage with this passive pretty easily. Finally, the last passive worth discussing is Piercing Spears. This will increase our crit damage by 10% straight up with no proc conditions. Crit damage is one of the most essential stats in the game, one so important that creating raid comps for 4 and 12-man content center around this stat. This is a great transition into the last foundational topic to understand before diving into the actual builds: stat optimization. This is going to be the most complicated part of the entire guide, so if you can wrap your head around this, it's all easy from here. First of all, one of the biggest things that I see new players hyperfixate on is the character stat sheet. This is a page full of useless information, at least for PvE, mostly because a lot of buffs and debuffs that you'll receive in 4 and 12-man content come from other players, and therefore won't always be reflected in your individual stats. This doesn't mean that we should ignore our stats, just the character sheet. Our two most important stats are penetration and critical damage. These damage modifiers are so strong that they have a cap, meaning that there's only a certain amount of these stats that you can have before the game doesn't let you benefit from building into them anymore. Crit damage is straightforward. Once you get to 125%, that's all that you can benefit from, but penetration is a bit more ambiguous. Every enemy in the game has an armor value, and penetration measures how much of that armor you ignore, resulting in a direct increase in your DPS. 12 and 4-man enemies all have 18,200 armor, and enemies in solo content vary pretty dramatically, maxing out at up to that 18,200 pen value, and this is something that the solo builds are optimized around. The other damage modifiers are split into 3 pairs: spell and weapon crit chance, spell and weapon damage, and max resources. Remember, damage is calculated based on your highest of each of these stats, so speccing into just one of each of these pairs is always going to be the most efficient play. For example, we can increase our max stam or max mag with attribute points. We'll put all 64 points into just one of those 2 options, and we'll dump it into mag because our spammable is Magicka based and therefore going to take the majority of our resources. This train of thought tracks for each of these stats, so build into either max mag or max stam, either weapon or spell crit, and either weapon or spell damage. So what you might be asking now is which of these stats are the most important? Well, getting to pen cap is the most important thing to do. But remember, this is mostly done with a good raid comp. The most you would have to do in 12-man is run a piece of light armor to make up what little pen you should be missing. Then getting to the 125% crit damage cap is the next most important thing to do, which again should mostly be done with good raid comping. But this is the reason that we choose to run primarily medium armor on every build. More on armor type bonuses shortly, but after that, the easiest way to compare stat increases is based on what the game offers on our sets. We most often can get 657 crit chance, 129 weapon and spell damage, or 1096 max resources from the 2 through 4 piece bonuses of nearly every set in the game. The crit chance will increase our damage slightly more than the weapon and spell damage, which will increase our damage a bit more than max resources. As a final note to this topic, not one stat is better than another per se. What makes this train true is how much of X stat we get in comparison to Y stat. So 657 crit chance is better than 129 weapon and spell damage, but a set like Sororia that offers over 600 weapon and spell damage will be a larger damage increase than a set like Mother's Sorrow, which offers a ton of critical chance. This can get really complicated to calculate, so the easiest thing to do is to mostly disregard the character sheet, make sure that you're built to hit the pen and crit cap, and then just run the meta sets for the best damage. Really focus your brain power on making small changes to your build to hit the pen and crit cap as necessary. And that's a great transition into medium and light armor optimization. Running medium or light armor is not based on your mag or stam spec character. Instead, it's based on reaching the cap to our 2 most important stats. In 4 and 12-man content, we have more ways to reach the pen cap far more easily than we do the crit damage cap, so we run primarily medium armor because of the dexterity passive, which which gives 2% crit damage per piece of medium armor. Medium armor also offers a buff slightly more preferable than the light armor variation. The agility passive increases our weapon and spell damage by 2% per medium armor piece as well. Light armor, on the other hand, gives us 939 penetration for each light armor piece equipped, thanks to the concentration passive, and it gives 219 weapon and spell crit per light armor piece through the prodigy passive. This is one of those situations, the 2% weapon and spell damage is greater than the 219 weapon and spell crit. The difference between the weapon and spell damage and the weapon and spell crit bonuses ultimately are very minor though. The main focus with medium and light armor is crit damage versus penetration. For added ease, I've included the most common sources of pen and crit damage in the Discord so that you can easily do the math and see what you do and don't need in your own builds to hit these caps. We are almost there. The final consideration to building a gear setup is based around our trial set. I know that in a new player setting, getting into trials can be tough, but for maximizing damage, it really should be a goal to get even an unperfected trial set, due to the minor slayer bonus. Every trial set in the game's third piece gives minor slayer, which increases damage done to monsters by 5% and is simply the strongest one-piece stat in the game. You can only benefit from this once though, as it is a minor buff, so running 2 trial sets is usually a bit unoptimal as it results in a wasted third piece bonus. The only exception to this rule is when you are running a mythic like Oaken Soul in a 1-bar build, which does offer minor slayer. If this is the case, this optimization element is irrelevant. With all of the fundamentals squared away, let's discuss the things that each build will share. If you're newer to the game, all of the different things that you need for raiding might feel a bit confusing. Food, potions, mundus, etc. To make it simple, I'm going to give you a checklist of all of the miscellaneous items that you need to maximize your damage so that you don't have to worry. This includes your race, mundus, attributes, food, potions, traits, enchants, and champion points. So with that, starting with our race, whichever option you choose will have an extremely minimal impact on your overall damage, with maybe the exception being solo content. For organized 12-man raiding, High Elf will be the strongest choice, offering some weapon and spell damage, the most max mag of any other option, and a little bit of sustain help as well. Something super beneficial for the Magplar specifically, since sustain can be really tough. Dark Elf will be the next best option, giving the same amount of weapon and spell damage and nearly the same amount of max mag, but also offering nearly 2k max stam. I like Dark Elf because it gives you the ability to switch between mag and stam specs with no penalty in damage, but sustain will be a little harder with this option. If you'd like, Orc is an extremely close third within a 1-2% damage difference, but this race has a passive that heals you whenever you deal damage. This is a nice added layer of safety. In solo or 4-man content though, Khajiit will by far be the best option. This class offers a ton of passive critical damage and becomes necessary to hit the previously mentioned crit damage cap in 1, 2, and 4-man scenarios. For our Mundus Stone, the Thief will almost always be the best option, offering a ton of crit chance. There are other options that you can use in really specific situations, but I wouldn't worry about that right now. For our attributes, we will be putting all 64 points into Magicka. For our consumables, we will use food and potions to do 2 main things: increase our max stats and therefore damage, and help with any sustain issues that we might have. If you have sustain issues, you can use food to solve your problem. However, most sustain issues come from a poor rotation, so I would attempt to solve your problem there first and only use food to solve sustain issues as a last resort. For straight damage, the green max mag food options will be the strongest. However, most players tend to run blue max mag, max health food, mainly because it offers only a little bit less max mag, but gives you a ton of health. One of few situations where the amount of survivability that we gain is worth the very small amount of damage that we lose. If you're struggling with sustain, you can use Ghastly Eyeball, which offers max mag and a ton of magic recovery, or Clockwork Citrus Fillet, which gives less max mag and mag recovery, but does offer some health. For our potions, we will mostly choose to run the Alliance Spell or Essence of Spell power pots. These potions offer the largest buffs in the game: Major Sorcery and Brutality, which increase spell and weapon damage by 20%, Major Prophecy and Savagery, which increase spell and weapon critical chance by 12%, and Major Intellect, which increases Magicka recovery by 30% in addition to restoring some mag. You can craft these by combining Cornflower, Lady Smock, and Water Hyacinth, or purchase the Alliance Spell Power Potions in Cyrodiil. If you want to get sweaty, you can use Heroism pots with the 2-bar rotations to start a parse, and then switch to the Alliance pots when you stop casting Degen and Vamp Bane, skills that offer the major weapon and spell damage and weapon and spell spell crit buffs respectively. Heroism pots restore mag and stam, offer the major mag and stam recovery buffs, and give minor heroism, increasing your ult gen a bit. These provide a pretty small damage increase though and are incredibly expensive to craft, requiring Dragon's Rune, Dragon's Blood, and Columbine. Keep in mind that heroism pots should not be used in the 1-bar build. For our gear traits and enchants, our body pieces are super simple. They'll always be divines with max magicka enchants. Our jewelry will almost always be bloodthirsty with spell damage enchants. Our weapons are the only thing that can vary a bit, but generically run your front bar weapon or weapons charged and your back bar infused. When running daggers on the front bar, flame and poison enchants will typically be the best option, and if you have a two-handed weapon on the front bar such as a staff, run a flame enchant. On the back bar, I use a weapon damage enchant for 4 and 12-man content and a crusher enchant for solo content for a bit of extra pen. Finally, for our champion points, I suggest running Deadly Aim, Thaumaturge, Wrathful Strikes, and Fighting Finesse. In general, the first 3 CP are choices that will rarely leave your bar as they'll just offer the highest damage increase in this bar setup. Fighting Finesse, however, is something that I recommend for newer players in newer groups who might suffer from a less optimized comp and or lower uptimes from the support that would keep your crit damage from hitting the 125% cap. In 4-man and solo content, you probably won't be able to hit crit cap without this CP, so it's just a good generic option. You can run Backstabber instead though if you're sure that you can stand behind your target for the entire duration of a fight if you'd like. And if your group is very optimized in 4 and 12-man situations, you can run Exploiter instead, which is one of, if not the strongest CP slottable in the game, but it relies on other people doing a really good job with uptimes in order for you to gain any value. This is the CP that we use while parsing on the dummy though. As a final option in solo content, I've been running Force of Nature over Wrathful Strikes for a little bit of extra penetration, but this choice really is debatable. It's probably worthwhile for boss fights, but a bit of a loss in the many AoE situations that solo content demands, so do with that information what you will for your own builds. Now getting into our first build, starting with our 105k 1-bar setup. This is for players who are a bit uninterested in maximizing damage, or even for players who might not have the capacity to do a 2-bar build. If you are somebody interested in eventually pushing very difficult content, I'd advise skipping to the next build, our 2-bar static setup, where you can push up to 130k DPS. For each of these builds, I start with the strict meta setup, followed by some gear alternatives for situations where the meta sets might not work too well, or if you just want something different, ending with a variation created specifically for solo content. So with that, starting with our meta 12-man build, the setup that we'll use to push 105k on the dummy and that will do the most single target damage in content will involve running Perfected Arms of Reliquin on the weapons and jewelry, Highland Sentinel on the body, the Velathier Mage's Amulet, and one piece of the Slimecraw monster set. When all raid buffs are present, Velathier ends up being quite a bit better than Oakensoul even for a 1-bar build, and it does give you that second bar to load up with sustain or survivability based skills, or to just ignore completely. It's totally up to your preference. Keep in mind though that Oakensoul will pull ahead in any situation where there's no real raid comp or reliable support buff and debuff uptimes. This does include solo content. As a final miscellaneous note, if you're dummy humping to try to hit some damage requirement a core team might have, you'll likely get a little more damage out of the Exploiter CP as opposed to Fighting Finesse, since the 21 mil gives you all of the raid buffs that you need to get to 125% crit damage. In content though, you'll most likely want to use Fighting Finesse. Reliquin comes from the trial Cloud Rest and simply deals stacks of damage whenever you light attack, so maintaining a regular rotation will maximize your damage with this set, and Highland Sentinel is a craftable from Gold Road that can sound a bit niche, since maximizing damage with this set requires you to not move, but people really freak out too much about this. The set's 2 to 4 piece bonuses alone make it competitive with other meta options, so even if you are at 0 stacks for an entire fight, which will never be the case, Highland will still be one of the strongest sets in the game, and if you can maintain even 5 stacks on average, it begins to outperform most of our meta sets. Furthermore, maintaining 10 stacks isn't as hard as you might think. With enough practice and experience, you can gain enough knowledge about mechanics and mechanic timing to prepare yourself with good positioning or mitigation preemptively so that you don't have to move. Working with these sets in content is a good goal to work up to, but in the meantime, if you don't want to concern yourself with the movement minigame associated with Highland Sentinel, Deadly Strike is your next best replacement, only being a few K DPS off of Highland with no real proc condition, simply increasing your damage done with channeled and damage over time abilities by 15%. This set can be purchased from the Velastris vendor in Cyrodiil or in Guild Traders, so it's pretty easy to get as well. If you're not a fan of Reliquin, I'd suggest running either Perfected Slivers of Null Arca if you want to emphasize single target DPS, or Perfected Onsol's Torment if you want to give yourself some extra AoE damage. Null Arca is from the new Trial Lucent Citadel and procs whenever you deal damage with a short cooldown, and Onsol simply increases your damage done by 7%, which doubles if you get an interrupt. The interrupt component isn't really worth considering here though, so Null Arca will be just as good as Reliquin with even slightly more damage potential if you get enough good crits, and Onsol will only be a 2 to 3k DPS loss. Finally, if you don't have access to any of these trial sets, you can run Order's Wrath, a craftable from High Isle that offers a bunch of crit chance and crit damage, again with no proc condition. If you run Order's Wrath, run Oakensoul instead of Velothi though, since Oakensoul does give Minor Slayer, a buff that outside of this mythic is only provided by trial sets. One seemingly odd thing that you'll notice about this Magicka build is that we are rocking daggers. Daggers count as 2 armor pieces, which means that you get a larger armor bonus, which directly results in a sizable weapon and spell damage increase. So daggers will be the strongest option for a 1-bar. However, if you want to run a staff so that you can heavy attack to restore mag, though I didn't find this necessary with Ghastly or Clockwork, even in solo content, a charged lightning staff with a flame enchant will be an incredibly close second, and an Inferno staff charged with a flame enchant will be an equally close third. I mean, we're talking maybe a couple K DPS off at the absolute most. Moving into our skills for this setup, starting with Barb Trap. Trap is a pretty solid dot on its own, outputting about 5k total DPS between the dot, the damage on application, and the damage done with hemorrhaging. This skill also provides a nice buff to our skills through the Slayer passive in the Fighter's Guild tree, which increases weapon and spell damage by 3% per Fighter's Guild ability slotted. Though something like Inner Light could be a stronger damage boost, having a solid stamina-based dot is going to be helpful in sustaining mag in this toolkit. On that note as well, Power of the Light is a short stamina-based ability and is the absolute foundation of the Templar's toolkit. Pottle will deal about 16k DPS in our 1-bar setup when maintained well, when also factoring in our damage done with Sundered, as well as proc a plethora of important passes discussed at the beginning of the video. Our primary spammable on the Plar will be Puncturing Sweeps. This ability rapidly deals damage 3 times per second at a max tick of about 18.5k each, resulting in up to about 55k damage per cast and 20k total damage per second. These are values that would be much higher if we used jabs all the way through a parse, but since we stop at 42% for Radiant Glory, jabs just doesn't get to fully benefit from our bloodthirsty jewelry. This ability also heals for 34% of the damage done, which makes the Templar feel indestructible in otherwise overwhelming situations that may contain a ton of enemies. This, in combination with our Execute Radiant Glory, prevents the Templar from having to run any sort of healing in this setup. Radiant Glory deals increased damage the lower a target's health is, with that scaling starting at 50%. It will become stronger than jabs at about 42%, and at 5% and below, it can do ticks of up to 135k in this 1-bar build. Now, keep in mind, Radiant Glory will tick 3 times in a 1.8 second window, so that means that Radiant Glory can do up to 200k DPS at the end of a fight, and using it for just 40% of a fight will still make it our strongest ability, outputting close to 30k DPS. Finally, Solar Barrage is a relatively weak dot in this setup, only responsible for about 4k DPS, but it will increase our damage done with class abilities by 5%, which ends up being a pretty significant buff for Power of the Light, Jabs, and Radiant Glory, our top 3 sources of damage. For our ultimate, we will opt to run Shooting Star. This will be the strongest ult that the Plar has access to for single target in this build, but the Destro ult will be a little stronger if you choose to run an Inferno Staff, and Empowering Sweep will be stronger in shorter fights. In fact, Empowering Sweep is technically a little stronger in terms of raw DPS output than Shooting Star, but because we have to cast it so much more often, we lose ticks of jabs and Radiant Glory, so Shooting Star squeaks out ahead in longer fights. For solo content, I'd make a few small changes. Getting as close to the pen and crit damage caps as we can, while sacrificing as little as possible, is going to be the focal point of this build. For our basic build elements, we'll get a pretty large damage increase by speccing into the Khajiit race, so if solo or 4-man content is your primary goal, I'd choose this race to start. Likewise, we will slot Force of Nature over Wrathful impactful strikes, and doing so with charged weapons will end up adding 2 to 3k extra pen on average. This is definitely a loss in shorter trash pulls, but a small damage increase in boss fights. For our gear, we will use Perfected Onsl's Torment in place of Reliquin as our trial set, since it is generically a meta option for AoE damage as well as single target, but also because it uniquely offers a line of penetration. We will run the crafted set Order's Wrath to primarily increase our crit damage a bit, but will benefit greatly from the crit chance as well. We will run the Oakensoul Mythic over Velothi since we are not receiving buffs and debuffs from anyone else, and we'll finish it off with one piece of the Slimecraw monster set in the lightweight, light to get some extra penetration. In fact, I found the damage bonus from Slimecraw, which offers the most crit chance out of any other one-piece item in the game, to be a slightly larger DPS increase than running a one-piece line of pen like Valken Scoria. As an alternative, if you don't have the trial set, you can run Deadly Strike instead. Finally, I would suggest running Razor Caltrops over Barb Trap, since Razor Caltrops is a strong and short stamina-based AoE that does good damage and offers Major Breach, the most important penetration debuff in the game. It reduces target armor by nearly 6k, so it's massive help in getting to that 18,200 cap. In this setup, we will have about 15k penetration and 110% crit damage, which is a little below both caps, but not bad at all. As a final note, even if you opt for a staff, stick with a charged flame enchant as opposed to a crusher. When we only have one weapon, getting a good source of status effect damage ends up being a bit more of a DPS increase than a crusher enchant, and especially when running Force of Nature, more status effects equals more pen anyway. So a crusher plus Wrathful, for example, would only be about 800 extra pen over a charged staff with Force of Nature, but this setup will add 2 to 4k DPS with status effects. Finally, for our rotation with this build, make sure that you start your parse far enough away so that casting Solar Barrage doesn't erroneously start the fight. We will start with the pre-buff of Shooting Star, Solar Barrage, then we will run up to the dummy and throw Trap, followed by our first light attack signaling the opening of the parse. That opening simply consists of Power of the Light plus 5 jabs, 4 total times, and then we will start the actual rotation, which we will repeat until about 42%. That rotation goes Power of the Light, Trap, Solar Barrage, jab 3 times, and then we will cast Power of the Light plus a jabs times 5 combo 3 more times and repeat that rotation until we get into Radiant Glory range. Here we will simply replace every jabs times 5 with 3 casts of Radiant Glory and every jabs times 3 with 2 casts of Radiant Glory. So it will go something like Power of the Light, Trap, Solar Barrage, Beam 2 times, then cast a Power of the Light plus Beam 3 times combo 3 more times. Once you get to about 12%, reapply Trap, Solar Barrage, and Power of the Light one more time, and beam only until the dummy dies. You can get around 100k DPS by doing this rotation perfectly and strictly static, but 105k becomes very attainable if you play Trap and Solar Barrage more dynamic, meaning that you would simply cast those skills the second that they run out in place of a spammable cast. If you want to get even sweatier, for the 105.5k that I did, I played the off balance minigame a bit as well, holding my 3rd and 4th ultimates for when the boss was off balance for a little bit of extra damage increase with the Exploiter CP on the dummy. And I also made sure that whenever the dummy was off balance below 42% to only cast Radiant Glory for the short duration, even if I had dots that needed to be reapplied. Now, getting into our 2-bar setup for the Magplar, this is the build to use if you're a bit newer to the class but looking to eventually get into difficult 12-man content. This static setup can produce around 130k on the 21mm dummy and is a great starting point to prepare you for the various setups that the Plar utilizes to maximize its damage in real content scenarios. As a reminder, we will start with the strictly single target setup, since this is usually the fight type worth optimizing for the most, but we will discuss set alternatives for situations where the meta sets might not work too well, or if you just prefer to run something different, ending with a setup designed specifically for solo content. So with that, starting with our 12-man setup, we will pair the trial set Perfected Arms of Reliquin with the new craftable from Gold Road Highland Sentinel, in addition to the Velothi Mage's Amulet, the Perfected Maelstrom Greatsword on the back bar, and one piece of the Slimecraw monster set. As a quick miscellaneous note, if you're dummy humping trying to meet a certain damage requirement a team might have, you'll get a little more damage out of the Exploiter CP as opposed to fighting Finesse, since the 21mm provides us with all the buffs that we need to reach the crit cap. In content though, unless your group is really well optimized, you'll likely benefit more from fighting Finesse to make up for the discrepancies in comp or buff up times from the support. With that, Perfected Arms of Reliquin is a pretty straightforward set from the trial Cloud Rest that deals damage whenever we light attack, damage that stacks up to 10 times. Simply maintaining a good rotation with consistent weaving will maximize damage with this set. We just have to make sure that we don't cast more than 3 abilities on the back bar or the stacks will fall off. This is something that the static rotation accounts for. Highland Sentinel is a craftable from the West Wield Zone that can sound a little niche since maximizing damage with this set requires you to not move, but people really freak out about this too much. This set's 2 through 4 piece bonuses alone make Highland Sentinel very competitive with other meta options, so even if you are at 0 stacks for an entire fight, which will realistically never be the case, Highland will still be one of the strongest sets in the game, and if you can maintain even half its stacks on average, it begins to outperform most of our meta choices. Furthermore, maintaining 10 stacks isn't even as hard as you might think. With enough practice and experience, you can gain enough knowledge about mechanics and mechanic timing to prepare yourself with good positioning or mitigation preemptively, so that you don't have to move. Using these sets well in content is a good goal to work up to. However, in the meantime, if you don't want to concern yourself with the movement minigame associated with Highland Sentinel, Deadly Strike is your next best replacement, only being a few K DPS off of Highland with no proc condition, simply increasing your damage done with damage over time and channeled abilities by 15%. This set can also be purchased from the Velastris vendor in Cyrodiil or in Guild Traders, so it's pretty easy to obtain as well. If you're not a fan of Reliquin, I'd suggest running either Perfected Slivers of Null Arca if you want to emphasize single target damage, or Perfected Onsl's Torment if you want to boost your AoE damage a bit. Null Arca is from the new trial Lucent Citadel and simply procs whenever you deal damage, and can even outperform Reliquin with good enough crit RNG. This proc can only hit one target at a time though, so you want to make sure that it only hits the main target you're attacking, which will get inconsistent if, say, one of your AoEs accidentally proc it on some random less important ad. Onsel, on the other hand, simply increases damage done by 7%, which doubles if you get an interrupt. This interrupt component isn't really worth considering though, so consider Onsel a set that simply is going to boost your damage, most of which for the Templar has a lot of AoE components, so that damage boost will just generically be good. Finally, if you're early into the game and you're having a rough time getting into raids, to get some of this trial gear, you can use Order's Wrath, a craftable set from the High Isle Zone in the meantime. Order's Wrath is great because it provides a ton of crit chance and crit damage, 2 of the best stats in the game. Regarding our secondary gear pieces, the Velothir Mage's Amulet will by far be the strongest mythic on the Plar, giving us a straight 15% damage increase, but reducing our light attack damage by 99%. This nerf in our light attack damage is felt far less on the Plar though, since one of our main spammables, Radiant Glory, is a 2-second channel, meaning we light attack a bit less often compared to most other classes anyway. And with that, since we want to keep Highland Sentinel on the body, we will have room for an arena weapon on the back bar, and the Maelstrom Greatsword will provide the strongest damage increase, buffing our damage done with direct damage by 12%. Sadly, this will not increase the damage of Radiant Glory, but it will buff almost everything else, resulting in about a 5% overall increase in damage. As an alternative though, most raid groups include Templars for Radiant Glory, so running a weapon like the Master's Bow, which gives about 300 weapon and spell damage to targets inflicted by poison injection, could be preferable since it will provide a large damage increase to our execute, despite only increasing our overall DPS by about 4 to 5%. The two options are very close, so choose what works best for you and your group. Finally, with all of this gear, we have room for a one-piece monster bonus, and Slimecraw gives the strongest one-piece buff in the game, oddly being the only set that offers 771 crit chance instead of the typical 657. Moving into our skills for the 2-bar build, starting on our front bar with Barb Trap. Trap is responsible for about 6k DPS in the setup between the dot itself, the damage dealt on application, and the damage dealt with the increased chance to apply the hemorrhaging status effect. We slot this ability on the front bar because it will increase the damage of the abilities on this bar thanks to the Slayer passive in the Fighter's Guild tree, which increases weapon and spell damage by 3% per Fighter's Guild ability slotted. Though something like Inner Light could be a stronger buff to our front bar, Trap also acts as a stamina-based dot, which is always helpful to have to relieve some pressure from our mag pool. And on that note, Power of the Light is a short stamina-based ability and is the absolute foundation of the Templar's rotation. Otto will deal about 18k DPS in this 2-bar rotation when maintained well, between its damage dealt on cast, on its explosion when the skill expires, and with the Sundered status effect as well. Sundered will deal some damage and increase our weapon and spell damage by 100, so not only is Pottle really good damage, it will also help maintain this unique status effect, in addition to the important passives discussed at the beginning of the video. Our primary spammable on the Magplar will be Puncturing Sweep. This ability ticks 3 times in a 0.8 second window at up to 21k per tick, resulting in up to about 64k for a single cast, producing about 13 to 14k DPS measured over the course of an entire fight. Keep in mind that this value would be a lot higher if we didn't stop using this ability at 42%, so it's very strong. Puncturing Sweep will also heal for 34% of the damage done, and is one of the primary reasons that we can get away with not slotting any defensive abilities on this class. Outside of a one-shot, if you're using jabs, you practically can't be killed. And a skill that perhaps makes this class feel even more untouchable, our Execute Radiant Glory is arguably the strongest ability in the game. This skill will deal increased damage to targets below 50% health, dealing more damage the less health the target has, resulting in a max tick of up to 155k. This ability will also tick 3 times in a 1.8 second window though, so over 2 seconds this ability can produce up to 450k total damage done. Radiant Glory will be worth using over jabs at about 42% as your primary spammable, and it will also heal you for 17% of the damage inflicted. Think about that, 17% of 100k means that you cannot die outside of a one-shot while using this ability. Insane damage and survivability for our Magplar. Our last primary skill on the front bar, Degeneration, is a relatively weak dot, only responsible for about 4k DPS. The primary reason that we run it is because it provides major sorcery and brutality, the major weapon and spell damage buff. This is one of 2 skills that allows us to run heroism potions, which will be a net DPS increase, especially when off balance is kept up well, since heroism pots will help ensure that our ult lines up with off balance to have its damage increased by Exploiter. Finally, Degeneration also increases our front bar damage thanks to the Magicka controller passive in the Mage's Guild tree, which increases max mag by 2% per Mage's Guild ability slotted. Since mag is our primary resource, we might as well slot this on our front bar to buff sweeps, pottle, and beam a little bit. And with that, for our ultimate on the front bar, Flawless Dawnbreaker will be slotted to increase our damage done with the Slayer passive mentioned earlier and to use over our primary ult when we start beaming. When activated, Dawnbreaker will do some damage on application, leave behind a small dot, and most importantly, give us 300 weapon and spell damage for 20 seconds. This increase in weapon and spell damage ends up being more worthwhile than an actual ultimate simply to get Radiant Glory ticking harder. Moving on to our back bar, starting with Ritual of Retribution, this is a very large and strong AoE unique to the Templar that ramps up in damage over time, with its last tick hitting for up to 19k, producing about 6k DPS over the course of a fight. In the static roto, we don't quite get the full value of this ability since we recast it a little early, and though unoptimal, it's not the end of the world. It will also give the Purify synergy, one of 2 synergies in the game that all 12 players can see at the same time, making it a must-have in-group for your Alkosh DD so that they can maintain perfect uptimes with the super important debuff set. Next up, Stampede, we primarily use to proc the effects of the Maelstrom Greatsword, and though Stampede only lasts for 15 seconds, the VMA Greatsword buff will last for 18, so we have a little wiggle room to let this ability drop off if needed. When maintained well though, the skill itself will produce a respectable 6k DPS when combining the dot with the damage on application. You'd run Endless Hail here instead if you were to run the Master's Bow. Our next skill, Carve, is a bit of an overrated dot since the skill itself will only produce 4 to 5k DPS when combining the dot with its damage on application. Its primary value is as an extremely long damage over time effect. Using Carve means that we will spend less casts reapplying a dot and instead get to spend more casts using our spammable. So when we compare Carve to other alternatives that produce roughly the same DPS, Carve squeaks out ahead because of the added spammable damage. As an added bonus, the skill also gives a small shield whenever you cast it, which can help mitigate some high damage dealing mechanics, such as the lightning AoE seen on Fallgraven hard mode. You would run Poison Injection here instead if you were to run the Master's Bow. And on that note, Vampire's Bane is another pretty weak dot, only dealing about 4k DPS, but it also has an extremely long timer like Carve, and it will give us Major Prophecy and Savagery, the major spell and weapon crit chance buff. When running Vamp Bane and Degen, we can drop the Alliance spell pots altogether in favor of heroism potions. However, since both of these dots are so weak, we will stop casting them pretty early and switch to the Alliance spell power pots to receive the buffs once we start beaming. That is, if you're trying to min-max your DPS. Our last main ability, Solar Barrage, is yet another relatively weak dot, only producing about 4k DPS, but it increases damage done with class abilities by 5%. This means an increase in damage to Power of the Light, Jabs, Radiant Glory, Ritual, and Vampire's Bane. This is a no-brainer simply because of its buff utility. And with that, our ultimate of choice, Shooting Star, will be the strongest ultimate that we can run for single target on the Plar. Shooting Star does a massive tick of damage on impact and leaves behind a relatively small AoE lasting for 10 seconds. Shooting Star will also restore ult per target hit. Despite not using this ultimate below roughly 45%, it will still produce a respectable 6 to 7k DPS. In some AoE situations though, you'll probably be better off using Empowering Sweeps. Though Empowering Sweep will do about as much, if not slightly more DPS than Shooting Star on paper, its low cost means that we spend more casts on Empowering Sweep and less casts on our spammable, resulting in a net loss. The benefit though is that it's a sticky dot, so if enemies are walking out of or not being hit by Shooting Star, Empowering Sweep will be a little better. Now let's discuss the changes that I would make for solo content. For our basic build elements, Khajiit will outperform all other options pretty considerably, helping us get much closer to that 125% crit cap when no buffs can be provided by others to do so. For this reason as well, I without a doubt use Fighting Finesse and even slot Force of Nature over Wrathful to try to get closer to pen cap. This, to be honest, is debatable. It's for sure a loss in trash pulls, but probably a little stronger for boss fights, so tailor that decision to whatever you tend to struggle with the most. For our gear, we will replace Highland Sentinel with Order's Wrath, a set that gives us a little less crit chance, but offers crit damage, a stat even more important in solo situations where we are our only source of it. We'll replace Reliquin with Perfected Onsl's Torment, a set generically good for DPS, but a trial set that also offers a line of pen, so we get closer to the pen cap as well as satisfy the need for Minor Slayer. Finally, we will replace the VMA Greatsword with the VMA Inferno. Perfected Crushing Wall, when paired with Wall of Elements, is one of the strongest AoE sets in the game. The massive size of Elemental Blockade makes it really good for dealing with the spaced out trash pulls solo content often contains. Finally, for our skills, starting on the front bar, I would suggest replacing Barb Trap with Quick Cloak. Cloak is good because it's a long stamina based dot that can be pre-buffed with out of combat and will give major expedition, helping you move from pull to pull faster, resulting in a better overall score. This skill also gives major evasion, a massive damage mitigation buff that decreases damage taken from AoEs by 20%. And with that, since we'll be running the Alliance spell pots most often, I'd suggest replacing Degen with Inner Light. In a mag spec, Inner Light is one of, if not the strongest buff skill that we can slot on our front bar, increasing our max mag by 7%. That is 5% from the ability itself and 2% from the Mage's Guild passive. Moving on to the back bar, the first change I would make is to replace Ritual with Rune Focus. Rune Focus gives a bunch of magicka regen, which feels necessary if you want to run any sort of food that gives you health in solo content. In addition to this, it leaves a rune on the ground that offers major resolve, dramatically increasing your armor and therefore survivability. Staying in the rune is a luxury, not a necessity. We mainly use the skill for the mag regen we get for simply casting the ability. Next up, obviously we need to replace Stampede and Carve since we are running the VMA Inferno. So we'll replace Stampede with Wall and Carve with the source of Major Breach, the largest penetration debuff in the game. I like to use Elemental Susceptibility for longer boss type fights since it's a 30-second dot, and Razor Caltrops for trash pulls since it provides the debuff in an AoE radius. Both of these skills will also do decent damage but are mainly slotted for Major Breach. Finally, again, since we are running spell power potions, there isn't a need for Vampire's Bane, so I like to use a scribed pull ability of some sort. I like Leashing Soul for the Maelstrom Arena since the adds usually spawn really far apart, scribed with the Pull Focus, the Class Mastery Signature, and the Breach Affix. I used Soul Burst though for Vatashrin as an AoE chain since the adds are usually close enough together to get grouped up nicely. I scribed this ability with the same scripts, the Pull Focus, Class Mastery Signature, and Breach Affix. As a final note, I do tend to use Shooting Star, though the Destro ult will be a little stronger and burstier. I like Shooting Star though because it's cheaper, and you can use it quite a bit more often with all the targets you end up hitting and therefore receiving the extra ult gen from. Finally, taking a look at the rotation, be sure to start far enough away from the dummy so that Solar Barrage doesn't erroneously start the fight. We'll start with a pre-buff of Solar Barrage, Shooting Star, and then we'll run up to the dummy while casting Stampede, followed by our first light attack signaling the opening of the parse. That opening goes Power of the Light, Ritual, Trap, Vampire's Bane, Degen, Carve, Power of the Light, Jab 5 times, Power of the Light, Stampede, Carve, Jab 3 times, and then we will start the actual rotation that we will repeat until the dummy is at about 42%. That rotation goes Power of the Light, Degen, Solar Barrage, Trap, Ritual, Vampire's Bane, Power of the Light, Stampede, Jab 4 times, Power of the Light, Jab 5 times, and repeat. Throughout the parse, we will reapply Carve and your ultimate dynamically, attempting to do so in place of a spammable when possible, but you can just throw them in whenever as needed. Just make sure that you don't cast more than 3 abilities on the back bar at a time so that you don't lose Reliquin, and try to avoid bar swapping off of jabs because doing so will usually result in you missing the 3rd tick of the ability. Likewise, if you want to squeeze a little more damage, you can play Vamp Bane dynamically. Just make sure that you cast Stampede right before a series of jabs so that you get the direct damage increase from the VMA Greatsword for all of your spammable casts. When we hit 42%, all that changes is that we replace our jabs casts with casts of Radiant Glory. The jabs times 4 becomes beam times 2, and the jabs times 5 becomes beam times 3. You should follow this execute rotation all the way until you're in the 15 to 20% range, at which point you'll go through the roto until you reapply all of your dots one more time, and then simply beam only. Remember to start using Dawnbreaker over Shooting Star once you start beaming, and if you want to add a little more damage, use ulti pots until you get to 42% and switch to spell power pots here. Once you hit the spell power pot and begin receiving the buffs from it, you can stop casting degen and Vamp Bane, which will allow you to beam a little more often. If you're using spell power pots all the way through, you can simply stop casting degen and Vamp Bane at 42% if you wish. In any case, I was able to get 130k in the most basic iteration of this rotation. Implementing all of these little tricks will only boost your damage by 2 to 3k at most, so only do so if you're interested in pushing yourself. And if you are interested in pushing yourself to the limit in maximizing the damage you deal on the dummy and in content so that you can begin progressing the most difficult encounters ESO has to offer, you'll want to check out my masterclass guide for the Templar, where I aim to teach you everything I know about min-maxing damage on this class in any and all situations.